What happens when three police officers see a 16-year-old black girl walking home from work and decide she's an easy target? What happens when their routine abuse of power collides with a force they never saw coming? On a quiet evening, in March 2021, Tiana Coleman was doing something millions of teenagers do every day walking home from her after-school job. Honor student, scholarship hopeful, daughter who always checked in with her parents. But to three East Haven police officers, she was something else entirely. A black girl alone on the street, which in their minds meant she was suspicious, defiant, and deserving of whatever they decided to do to her. They stopped her without cause. They demanded she submit to a search without justification, and when she dared to ask why, they decided she was resisting. What followed was a brutal beating that should have been just another unreported case of police violence against a black woman, the kind that happens every day across America, invisible to most, forgotten by the justice system. But this time was different. Because when Tiana Coleman pulled out her phone with bruised and swollen hands, she didn't call 911. She didn't call her mother. She called her father. And her father happened to be Samuel Coleman, director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. That single phone call would expose a web of corruption reaching from beat cops to City Hall, transform a community's understanding of justice, and prove that even in the face of overwhelming power, one voice speaking truth can change everything. This is the story of how police brutality against black women and girls, so often overlooked, minimized, and forgotten, finally found its reckoning. This is about more than one girl, one beating, one phone call. This is about the systematic violence that targets black women and girls at rates 40% higher than their white counterparts. About the Say Her Name movement fighting to make their stories visible, and about what happens when resistance meets power, truth meets corruption, and a community decides it will no longer be silent. Tiana Coleman grew up in a family that understood both service and struggle. Her father, Samuel Coleman, had risen through the ranks of federal law enforcement over 25 years, beginning as a field agent investigating white-collar crime and eventually becoming one of the highest-ranking black officials in FBI history. His appointment as director came after a distinguished career built on integrity, cultural competence, and an unwavering commitment to civil rights enforcement. Samuel's success hadn't insulated his family from the realities of being black in America. Tiana had been the talk multiple times about how to interact with police, how to keep her hands visible, how to comply even when she knew her rights were being violated. The family lived in East Haven, Connecticut, a town of 29,000 that prided itself on being a quiet suburban community. But like many such places, it harbored deep racial tensions beneath its polished surface. East Haven had a troubling history with race relations. In 2012, the town had been the subject of a major FBI civil rights investigation after officers were caught on video harassing Latino residents and business owners. 4 officers were eventually convicted of federal civil rights violations, and the department was placed under federal oversight for several years. But by 2021, many residents felt that little had actually changed. The department had simply become more careful about what it did in public. For black families like the Colemans, East Haven represented a complicated reality. It offered good schools, safe neighborhoods, and economic opportunities. But it also meant living under constant scrutiny from both neighbors and police who questioned their right to be there. Tiana had experienced this tension throughout her childhood. The teacher who seemed surprised by her academic performance, the store clerk who followed her through aisles, the neighbors who called police when she and her friends gathered in the local park. Despite these challenges, Tiana thrived. At 16, she maintained a 3.8 GPA while working part-time at Marshall's Grocery to save money for college. She had already been accepted to several universities and was preparing for an interview with Harvard's early admission program. Her teachers described her as mature, thoughtful, and quietly determined qualities that had served her well in navigating the often hostile environment of being one of only 12 black students in her graduating class. The East Haven Police Department that confronted Tiana that evening was an organization with a culture problem and went far beyond individual bad actors. Despite the federal oversight and reform promises following the 2012 investigation, the department remained dominated by officers who viewed their job as protecting certain residents from others. Internal communications later obtained by federal investigators revealed a pattern of racist language, aggressive enforcement in minority neighborhoods, and a code of silence that protected officers who crossed legal and ethical lines. Sergeant Mike Derling, the senior officer who would lead Tiana's assault, exemplified this culture. A 20-year veteran with multiple excessive force complaints that had been dismissed or buried, Derling viewed federal oversight as an intrusion and civil rights enforcement as an attack on law enforcement. He had trained younger officers like Knox and Ricks to see community members as potential threats rather than citizens deserving protection and respect. The broader context of 2021 made Tiana's experience particularly significant. The previous year had seen nationwide protests following the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others, yet police violence against black women remained largely invisible in public discourse. According to research published in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine, black women and girls experience fatal police violence at rates significantly higher than white women, yet their stories rarely receive the same attention as male victims. The Say Her Name campaign, launched by legal scholar Kimbrell Crenshaw and the African American Policy Forum, had been working since 2015 to highlight this invisibility. The campaign documented how black women experience police violence differently than men. They're more likely to be killed as collateral damage during raids or pursuits, more likely to experience sexual violence from officers, and more likely to have their characters attacked after they're victimized. This was the world Tiana Coleman inhabited on March 15, 2021, a world where being black and female made her simultaneously hypervisible to police suspicion and invisible to public sympathy, where her academic achievements and good character would be questioned the moment she was labeled a suspect, and where 3 officers would feel completely confident that they could brutalize her without consequence. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The evening of March 15th started like any other for Tiana Coleman. She finished her shift at Marshall's Grocery at 8:30 p.m., said goodbye to her coworkers, and began the familiar 15-minute walk home through East Haven's well-lit suburban streets. She had made this journey hundreds of times, often texting with her friend Jasmine about homework, college applications, and teenage life. Her phone buzzed with a message. "Girl, you're going to rock that Harvard interview next month." Tiana smiled, typing back her thanks as she walked past the neat lawns and modest homes that characterized her neighborhood. She was less than 3 blocks from home when she noticed the police cruiser pulling alongside her. At first, she thought nothing of it. Police cars were common in East Haven, and officers often nodded or waved at residents they recognized. But this car slowed to match her pace, and she could feel eyes on her through the tinted windows. Her father's training kicked in: stay calm, be respectful, know your rights, but don't antagonize. The car pulled ahead and stopped. 3 officers emerged. Sergeant Mike Derling, a thick-set man with 20 years on the force and a reputation for aggressive policing. Officer James Knox, younger but eager to prove himself. And Officer Rick Ricks, whose imposing 6'4" frame was often used to intimidate residents into compliance. "Evening, miss," Sergeant Derling said, his hand resting casually on his belt near his baton. "We need to have a quick chat with you." Tiana stopped walking, confusion evident in her voice. "Is there a problem, officer?" "Random check, that's all," Derling replied, though his tone suggested this was anything but routine. We've had some reports of suspicious activity in the area. Need to search your bag and check your ID. This was Tiana's first test. She knew. Her rights police couldn't search her without reasonable suspicion of criminal activity, and random checks weren't legal grounds for detention. But she also knew the reality of being a black teenager confronted by 3 armed officers on a dark street. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. Sometimes being right isn't worth being dead. What kind of suspicious activity? She asked politely, pulling out her student ID. I'm just walking home from work at Marshall's. I live 3 blocks from here. Officer Knox circled behind her, a tactical move designed to make her feel surrounded and vulnerable. That's a lot of questions for someone who's not doing anything wrong, he said. You got some kind of attitude problem? Tiana felt her heart rate increase. She recognized the script police create a confrontational dynamic, then use any response as justification for escalation. No, sir, I don't have an attitude. I'm just trying to understand why I'm being stopped. Because we're police officers. And we said so, Rix interjected, moving closer. Now are you going to cooperate, or are we going to have a problem? What happened next was captured on multiple cell phone cameras by residents who had begun gathering at their windows, drawn by the unusual sight of 3 police cars surrounding a teenage girl. The footage would later become crucial evidence, but in that moment, Tiana was alone with 3 officers who had already decided she was guilty of something. When she asked to call her parents before submitting to a search, Derling interpreted this as resistance. Put your hands behind your back, he ordered. You're under arrest for obstruction of justice and resisting arrest. Resisting what arrest? Tiana asked, genuine confusion in her voice. I haven't done anything wrong. That questioned perfectly. Reasonable, legally sound, constitutionally protected was apparently the last straw. Derling grabbed her arm and spun her around roughly. When she instinctively pulled away to maintain her balance, he slammed her against the nearest car hood. Stop resisting, he shouted, though the phone videos clearly showed Tiana offering no physical resistance beyond trying to protect her head as blows began to fall. Knox joined in, using his baton to strike her legs while she was pinned against the car. Rix grabbed her hair and forced her face against the metal hood, scraping her cheek against the rough surface. The assault lasted 90 seconds. 90 seconds of 3 grown men using batons, fists, and their body weight against a 120-pound teenager whose only crime had been walking home from work. Please stop, Tiana gasped, tasting blood from her split lip. I'm not resisting, please. But the officers were caught up in their own narrative now. They had decided she was a threat, and any injury they inflicted was justified by their belief in her dangerousness. This is how police violence works, officers. Create scenarios that justify the violence they want to inflict, then use that violence as evidence of the threat they claim to perceive. When they finally stepped back, Tiana lay crumpled on the ground, her marshal's grocery uniform torn, her face swollen, her ribs aching from the baton strikes. Bystanders were shouting at the officers to stop, but their protests were ignored. One neighbor, Mrs. Ernestine Hightower, a retired school principal, stepped forward with her phone recording. That's enough, she called out. She's just a child. Officer. Rix turned toward Mrs. Hightower, his hand moving to his taser. Back up, ma'am, or you'll be arrested for interfering with police business. It was then, as the officers began discussing what charges to file against her, that Tiana managed to reach her phone. Her hands were shaking, her vision blurred from the head impacts, but she managed to activate the emergency recording function and dial a number she knew by heart. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Tiana, it's past your curfew. Honey, where are you? Dad, she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Dad, I need help. The police. They beat me up, and I don't know why." Samuel Coleman, director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, had been preparing for bed in his Washington, D.C. home when his daughter's call came through. In an instant, his world shifted from the routine concerns of running a federal agency to the primal terror of a father whose child was in danger. "Where are you exactly?" he asked, his voice shifting into the calm, focused tone that had served him through decades of crisis management. As Tiana provided her location, Samuel was already moving, grabbing his badge and service weapon, calling his deputy director to mobilize emergency response teams. Within minutes, federal agents in Connecticut were receiving urgent orders to converge on East Haven. The three officers who had just brutalized a teenage girl had no idea that their world was about to change forever. They were still deciding whether to take her to the hospital or directly to jail when the first FBI vehicles began arriving on scene. The immediate aftermath of Tiana's beating revealed the true scope of corruption within East Haven's power structure. As FBI agents secured the scene and began documenting evidence, local officials launched into damage control mode that would ultimately expose a conspiracy reaching from beat cops to City Hall. Within hours of the federal agents' arrival, Mayor Walter Bixby held an emergency meeting with Police Chief Vernon Nathis and other city officials. Their primary concern wasn't the assault on a teenager, it was containing the political fallout. Phone recordings later obtained through federal subpoenas revealed their strategy: discredit Tiana, minimize the incident, and frame it as a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by an overzealous federal response. Chief Mathis immediately began working to suppress evidence. The officers' body cameras had mysteriously malfunctioned during the incident, and the department's official report described Tiana as combative and threatening. Security footage from nearby businesses began disappearing, and witnesses found themselves facing increased police scrutiny in their daily lives. But the community's response told a different story. Mrs. Ernestine Hightower, the retired principal who had witnessed the assault, began organizing neighborhood meetings in her home. Word spread through black churches, community centers, and social media networks. Within a week, East Haven's small but determined black community had mobilized in ways the white power structure had never anticipated. "We've all seen this before," Mrs. Hightower told a gathering of 30 residents in her living room. "Our children get brutalized, the police lie about it, and nothing changes. But this time is different. This time we have evidence, we have federal attention, and we have each other." The federal investigation moved with unprecedented speed and scope. Samuel Coleman had recused himself from direct involvement to avoid conflicts of interest, but the FBI's Civil Rights Division treated the case with the urgency typically reserved for terrorism investigations. Agent Sarah Martinez, a veteran civil rights prosecutor, led a team that began uncovering years of systematic abuse. What they found was staggering. East Haven police had been operating what essentially amounted to a protection racket, offering lighter enforcement to businesses that made donations to police charities while harassing those that didn't comply. Officers routinely planted evidence, filed false reports, and used excessive force, particularly against residents of color. The department had its own private servers to store sensitive materials, including videos of police misconduct, that were used to blackmail officers into silence. Tiana's assault had been captured not just by civilian phones, but by multiple surveillance cameras. However, city officials had immediately classified this footage as evidence in an ongoing investigation, making it unavailable to the public or media. They seemed confident that federal interest would wane and the story would fade from public attention. They underestimated both the community's determination and the technological savvy of young activists. Jasmine Washington, Tiana's best friend, was a talented computer science student who who had been quietly documenting police misconduct. In East Haven for months, working with a network of youth activists, she began systematically exposing the contradictions in official statements. When the police claimed their body cameras had malfunctioned, Jasmine pointed out that the same officer's cameras had worked perfectly during a traffic stop 2 hours earlier. When city officials claimed no surveillance footage existed, she identified 12 different cameras that would have captured the incident. When the mayor suggested Tiana had been uncooperative, she released audio of the 911 calls from neighbors, begging police to stop the assault. The resistance extended beyond East Haven. National civil rights organizations, alerted by FBI Director Coleman's involvement, began focusing unprecedented attention on the case. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund sent attorneys to monitor the investigation. The African American Policy Forum's Say Her Name campaign highlighted Tiana's story as an example of the police violence against Black women that too often goes unnoticed. But the most powerful resistance came from Tiana herself. Despite physical injuries that required weeks to heal and psychological trauma that would last much longer, she refused to be silenced. Against her lawyer's advice and her parents' concerns, she insisted on giving interviews, testifying before federal investigators, and speaking at community meetings. "They want me to disappear," she told a packed auditorium at the local community college. "They want me to be ashamed, to hide, to pretend this didn't happen. But I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to make sure everyone knows what they did, and I'm going to make sure it never happens to anyone else." Her courage inspired others to come forward. Within weeks, federal investigators were hearing from dozens of East Haven residents with their own stories of police abuse. Maria Santos, a Latina woman who had been sexually assaulted by an officer during a traffic stop. James Williams, a Black veteran who had been beaten for talking back when he asked why he was being arrested. Sarah Chun, an Asian American teenager who had been strip-searched at school based on an anonymous tip that later proved false. The pattern that emerged was clear. East Haven police had been systematically targeting people of color, particularly women and girls, confident that their victims lacked the resources or connections to fight back effectively. They had operated with impunity for years, protected by a code of silence and a power structure that valued order over justice. Local officials escalated their intimidation campaign. Anonymous flyers appeared in Black neighborhoods warning residents against cooperating with outside agitators. Police increased patrols in areas where community meetings were being held. City inspectors suddenly found violations at businesses owned by vocal critics of the department. But instead of silencing resistance, these tactics only strengthened community resolve. Churches that had never been politically active began hosting civil rights meetings. High school students organized walkouts demanding police accountability. Local businesses owned by people of color formed a mutual support network to resist. Official harassment. The struggle was taking its toll on Tiana and her family. Death threats arrived daily, requiring FBI protection. Samuel Coleman faced pressure from political allies who worried that his personal involvement in the case was compromising his effectiveness as FBI director. Tiana's mother, Dr. Michelle Coleman, a pediatrician at Yale New Haven Hospital, found herself under professional scrutiny as colleagues questioned whether her family was making trouble for the community. Yet the resistance continued to grow, fueled by a simple truth that no amount of official pressure could change. 3 police officers had brutally assaulted an innocent teenager, and the community had watched it happen. No amount of victim blaming, evidence tampering, or intimidation could alter that fundamental reality. 3 months after the assault, East Haven officials made a fatal miscalculation. Confident that federal attention was waning in community, resistance was containable, Mayor Bixby announced a town hall on community safety designed to reframe the narrative and restore public confidence in local law enforcement. The event was scheduled for July 15th at the East Haven High School auditorium, with carefully selected speakers and a format designed to limit public input. Chief Mathis would present reforms that were mostly cosmetic changes to policy language. Business leaders would testify about the importance of supporting local police. The mayor would announce new community policing initiatives that sounded progressive, but changed nothing substantive. What city officials didn't anticipate was that the community had been preparing for this moment since Tiana's assault. Led by Mrs. Hightower and other veteran activists, residents had organized a comprehensive response that would turn the mayor's propaganda event into a moment of reckoning. Tiana had been reluctant to attend. The trauma of the assault had left her with anxiety attacks and difficulty sleeping. The constant security presence, while necessary, made her feel like a prisoner in her own life. Her Harvard interview had been postponed indefinitely, and the future she had planned seemed increasingly distant. But as she sat in her family's living room the night before the town hall, watching local news reports that continued to minimize her assault and question her credibility, something shifted. The scared 16-year-old who had been brutalized by police officers was still there, but she was joined by someone new, a young woman who understood that her voice could be a weapon against injustice. "I'm going," she told her parents. "I'm going to tell the truth, and I'm going to make sure everyone hears it." The town hall began according to the mayor's script. A carefully selected audience of roughly 200 people filled the auditorium, with most seats occupied by city employees, police family members, and business owners who depended on city contracts. The handful of community activists who had managed to secure tickets were scattered throughout the audience, outnumbered but not outmaneuvered. Mayor Bixby opened with remarks about the importance of healing and moving forward. Chief Mathis presented his reform package, which included new training requirements that were actually federal mandates the department was already required to implement. Several business leaders spoke about their confidence in local law enforcement and their concern about outside interference in community affairs. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The public comment period limited to 3 minutes per speaker, with topics restricted to constructive suggestions for community improvement. Mrs. Hightower was the first to approach the microphone. At 72 years old, she commanded respect even from those who disagreed with her politics. Her voice was steady as she began to speak. "I've lived in East Haven for 45 years," she said. "I've seen this community at its best and its worst. 3 months ago, I watched 3 police officers beat a 16-year-old girl on my street. Not restrain her, beat her with batons, while she begged them to stop." Mayor Bixby tried to interrupt, citing the restrictions on comment topics, but Mrs. Hightower continued speaking. "That girl is here tonight. Her name is Tiana Coleman, and she has something to say to this community." As Tiana rose from her seat, a murmur rippled through the auditorium. City officials had not expected her to attend, and they certainly hadn't prepared for her to speak. She walked slowly to the microphone, her steps steady despite the trembling in her hands. For a moment, she stood silent, looking out at an audience that included her attackers' families, city officials who had tried to discredit her, and community members who had risked their own safety to support her. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a strength that surprised even her. "My name's Tiana Coleman. 3 months ago, Officers Durling, Knox, and Ricks beat me with batons while I was walking home from work. I was 16 years old. I had done nothing wrong. They nearly broke my ribs. They split my lip. They gave me a concussion that I'm still recovering from." The auditorium was completely silent now. Even the mayor had stopped trying to interrupt. "I've heard people say I must have done something to deserve it. I've heard people say I was resisting arrest, even though I was never told I was under arrest until after they started beating me. I've heard people say this whole thing is being blown out of proportion. Tiana reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. On the screen was the video that had started it all, the recording she had secretly made during the assault, capturing audio of the officers laughing as they struck. Her joking about teaching her respect. "This is what really happened," she said, and pressed play. The audio filled the auditorium, the sound of batons striking flesh. Tiana's pleas for the officers to stop, and most damning of all, Officer Knox's voice saying, "Bet she won't walk around here like she owns the place anymore." When the recording ended, the silence was absolute. Then, slowly, people began to stand. First Mrs. Hightower, then other community activists, then high school students, then families who had never spoken publicly about their own encounters. With police brutality in that moment, the town hall ceased to be the mayor's carefully orchestrated PR event and became something entirely different. A community's declaration that it would no longer accept the unacceptable, no longer tolerate the intolerable, and no longer remain silent in the face of injustice. The federal arrests began the next morning. The reckoning that followed Tiana's courageous testimony at the town hall was swift and comprehensive. Within 48 hours, FBI agents armed with federal warrants had arrested Mayor Walter Bixby, Police Chief Vernon Mathis, and all 3 officers involved in the assault. The charges were extensive: civil rights violations, conspiracy to obstruct justice, evidence tampering, and in the case of several officers, additional counts related to a pattern of abuse stretching back years. The federal investigation revealed the full scope of corruption within East Haven's power structure. Mayor Bixby had received kickbacks from businesses seeking favorable treatment, while using police resources to intimidate his political opponents. Chief Mathis had operated what amounted to a criminal enterprise within the police department, with officers paying him percentages of their illegal seizures and side jobs. The department's private servers contained hundreds of hours of misconduct footage that had been used to control officers rather than discipline them. Officer Durling, the sergeant who had led Tiana's assault, faced the most serious charges. Federal investigators discovered that he had a history of targeting young black women, often using traffic stops or street encounters as pretexts for sexual harassment and physical abuse. His victims had been afraid to come forward, but Tiana's courage in speaking out had given them the strength to tell their own stories. The trials, when they came, were swift and decisive. Faced with overwhelming evidence, including body camera footage, cell phone videos, and testimony from dozens of victims, all 3 officers pleaded guilty to federal civil rights violations. Durling received a sentence of 15 years in federal prison. Knox and Ricks each received 10 years. Mayor Bixby and Chief Mathis received sentences of 12 and 14 years respectively. But the most significant changes weren't in the courtroom. They were in the community itself. East Haven's City Council, under federal oversight, implemented comprehensive police reforms that went far beyond cosmetic policy changes. The entire police department was disbanded and rebuilt from scratch, with new officers recruited nationally and trained specifically in constitutional policing and de-escalation techniques. Patricia Rodriguez, a Latina former federal agent with extensive experience in civil rights enforcement, was appointed as the new police chief. Her first acts included establishing a civilian oversight board with real power to investigate misconduct, implementing mandatory body cameras that couldn't be turned off during police interactions, and creating a community liaison program that actually involved community members in police. Policy-making. The federal settlement with East Haven included $2.3 million in compensation for Tiana and her family. But more importantly, it established a permanent federal monitor to oversee police reform efforts. The settlement also funded community programs designed to repair relationships between law enforcement and residents of color, Tiana's personal recovery, was longer and more complex than the legal resolution. The physical injuries healed within months, but the psychological trauma required ongoing therapy and support. She struggled with anxiety, particularly around police officers, and had to rebuild her sense of safety in the world. Yet she also discovered reserves of strength and purpose she hadn't known she possessed. Her Harvard interview, when it finally took place, focused not just on her academic achievements, but on her experience with civil rights advocacy. She was accepted with a full scholarship and a special invitation to participate in the university's Civil Rights Leadership Program. During her freshman year, Tiana established the Say Her Name Scholarship Fund, providing financial support for young women of color who had been victims of police violence. The fund also supported research into the specific ways that police brutality affects Black women and girls, filling gaps in academic understanding that had allowed such violence to remain invisible for too long. The broader impact of Tiana's case extended far beyond East Haven. Her story became a cornerstone of the Say Her Name campaign, demonstrating that Black women's experiences of police violence deserved the same attention and outrage as those of Black men. Police departments across the country began reviewing their policies around interactions with women and girls, particularly regarding searches and use of force. Most importantly, Tiana's courage had shown other victims that they didn't have to suffer in silence. Federal civil rights prosecutors reported significant increases in complaints from Black women and girls following the East Haven case, suggesting that visibility and accountability could begin to break the cycle of abuse and silence that had protected abusive officers for generations. 5 years later, East Haven had been transformed from a symbol of systemic police abuse into a model for community-centered law enforcement reform. Crime rates had declined, community satisfaction with police had increased dramatically, and the town had attracted national attention as an example of what was possible when communities refused to accept the unacceptable. Today, when we speak about police violence in America, we too often focus solely on the cases that capture headlines, usually involving Black men and boys. But Tiana Coleman's story reminds us that police brutality is not gender neutral, and neither should be our response to it. Black women and girls experience police violence at rates 40% higher than white women, yet their stories remain largely invisible in public discourse. They are more likely to be sexually assaulted by officers, more likely to be killed as collateral damage during raids, and more likely to have their characters attacked when they seek justice. The Say Her Name campaign exists because these experiences have been systematically ignored, minimized, and forgotten. Tiana's story is exceptional, not because of what happened to her, sadly. Police violence against Black girls is far too common, but because she had resources and connections that most victims lack. Her father's position as FBI director gave her access to federal protection and investigation that other families can only dream of. This raises uncomfortable questions about justice in America. Why should a victim's access to accountability depend on their family's connections? Why do we need a federal investigation to treat police brutality as a serious crime? The reforms in East Haven show us what's possible when communities refuse to accept systemic abuse. But lasting change requires more than individual cases of accountability. It requires a fundamental shift in how we understand police violence, how we support victims, and how we hold institutions accountable for protecting the vulnerable rather than the powerful. Every time we say Breonna Taylor's name, Atashiana Jefferson's name, Sandra Bland's name, we honor not just their memories, but all the Black women and girls whose stories we'll never know. Tiana Coleman survived to tell her story, but she shouldn't have needed to be extraordinary to receive justice. The next time you hear about police reform, ask whether it addresses the specific vulnerabilities of Black women and girls. The next time you see a story about police violence, ask whose voices are being centered and whose are being ignored. And remember that behind every statistic about police brutality is a person, a daughter, a sister, a student, a dreamer who deserved better from the system that was supposed to protect her. Justice for Tiana Coleman was just the beginning. True justice will come when no girl has to make that phone call, when no community has to organize resistance meetings in living rooms, when no family has to choose between safety and speaking truth. Until then, we must continue to say her name, and all their names, until the silence that protects police violence finally breaks, and the promise of equal protection under law becomes a reality for everyone.